Please subscribe and don't forget to press the bell icon to get notified whenever we upload a new video.
Hello and welcome to this special interview with Dr. Raghuram Rajan, former Governor, Reserve Bank of India. Professor Rajan, thank you very much for agreeing to this interview. Well, let me first up say that I had invited Dr. Rajan for my ongoing series, Reimagining PSU Banks. These banks were nationalized overnight on the whim of a Prime Minister without any debate or discussion in Parliament. Now with the bad loan issue and a big fraud hitting these banks, what I'm asking in this series is, does India need to reimagine PSU banks? But this time with enough debate, which is why we have a person like Raghuram Rajan joining us. Well, Dr. Rajan, first, for starters, we have to start with the fraud because that is the reason why we are asking this question. Whose fault is it? Is it the fault of the owner of the bank, the auditor, the regulator, or the management?
Well, Latha, there's plenty of blame to go around, but I think it's important to first focus on why the fraud occurred and what systems were inadequate. In any such thing, and I'm sure the investigation will go into all these details, but why, was this letter of undertaking given? Why was it not recorded in the banking system? Did it appear did management take notice of it? Was it put before the board? And of course, after that, did the auditors pick it up? If they didn't, why didn't they pick it up? Because auditors go branch by branch. And then were the regulators' instructions obeyed over time, or were they not? And why were they not obeyed? And of course, the owner, in this case the government, which appoints the board members as well as the management, what is their culpability in this whole thing? I think every facet has to be examined. One of the important concerns about frauds that I had when I was at the RBI was that we unearthed them, but we never actually brought any of the culprits to book. So one of the things we did was we said we need to bring together all the people involved, both in unearthing as well as in investigating, and see how we can move forward. So we sent a list of the big frauds to the Prime Minister's office to try and get some action on that. So these are the kinds of things we need to figure out. When you were governor, many of these LOUs were signed and used to get letters of credit. And actually, a letter when you were a governor on August 3rd, 2016, was sent to all the banks asking them to thoroughly scrutinize the SWIFT system, audit it. Looks like you all were sensitive that a problem can come from this connectivity, the SWIFT connectivity to the core banking system. Can the supervisor be blamed for not pushing hard enough to get their instruction implemented? Well, I think, again, before we assign blame, we have to know what happened and why it happened. In many banking systems, there are so many ways of getting around the system. And we have to understand that when a way is discovered, for example, with the SWIFT system, it was the problem at Bangladesh Bank which unearthed the problems that were there. When the problem is discovered, it is important that the regulators send the message to the banks that we have unearthed this problem, now fix it in your systems. And of course, after that, the regulator basically assumes to some extent that the banks have fixed it. If they haven't, we have to understand why the banks didn't. I mean, when they were told about a problem, why wasn't the problem fixed? And I understand there were other reminders sent after that by the Reserve Bank, and we have to understand why they weren't obeyed. There is a fair amount of learning from this episode that we need to get, but surely there is plenty of responsibility to spread around.
Okay. Well, actually, hot from the oven news is that the Reserve Bank has banned LOUs. News coming in just about 10 minutes back. Way to go, you think?
Well, I can't opine on current policy, and I'm sure they've looked at the issues. One of my concerns in India is that there is sometimes a very cavalier treatment of guarantees, whether it is bank-given guarantees or government-given guarantees. We don't think these are real, and it's only when they are called upon by the entity that has relied on them that we understand that it's almost like giving a loan, or in fact more than giving a loan, because it's usually called upon when the loan is in distress. So it's actually like providing equity. And unless we account for these properly, there are huge contingent liabilities on the government balance sheet as well as on bank balance sheets, and it's important that we acknowledge them.
Okay, well, you're speaking about pushing blame around, and the government has picked up this 80-20 gold scheme as, one of the ways in which people were allowed to make money. What are your comments on, you must have heard what the government said about this.
Well, I mean, I have to say, as far as I understand, the PNB scheme scam started in 2011 and was unearthed in 2018.
Yeah.
The gold scheme that is under the scanner at this point was something which lasted between May 2014 and November 2014. It seems to me very hard to argue that whatever happened there, and I'm happy to talk more about that, but whatever happened there was in any way related to the scam, other than it happened in the same industry that there was gold involved. But I think it's important to treat these as two separate issues. I'm happy to talk about the 80-20 because I think the actions there, as far as I understand, were justified. But I think it's important to keep it separate from the scam. People conflate this all the time, and I think this seems to be a diversion of public interest rather than a focus on the key issues, which are important. Why is it that our banking system is leaking so much? How do we prevent the leaks, especially when there's so much new money going into the banking system as recapitalization?
Okay. Well, I take your point that this is, 80-20 is a gold scam and the LOUs happened on diamonds and the two are not related. Completely taken. But let me just delve on this 80-20 scheme. It goes as liberalization of, the number of people who could import. But it looks like only some people benefited. Is there not, how would you answer to that charge?
Well, first, what happens with a number of issues is the RBI is supposed to, talk with the government. The government sort of is often the prime mover, and the RBI is then supposed to ask whether the policy can be implemented and then announce the policy. Now, on the 80-20 gold scheme, remember the circumstances in which it was brought about. We had a foreign exchange crisis in 2013, and there was a great sense that the current account deficit was getting out of control. A big part of the current account deficit was big purchases of gold as real interest rates were strongly negative. And so when the public was moving into gold in a big way, the government thought that perhaps one stopgap arrangement, a temporary arrangement, would be to reduce the imports of gold. And so it brought in this 80-20 scheme, which said basically out of every 100 grams that you import of gold, you have to re-export 20. And there are a few entities, State Trading Corporation, etc., and a few public sector banks that would be allowed to import. That had a very important effect in quelling the imports of gold, which also meant that the pent-up demand to some extent for gold was building up because our jewelry industry was at a loss given that gold had been stopped. At this point, the Commerce Department started arguing that, well, maybe we should have some liberalization and we should open it up to more players to import gold so that there's more free flow of gold into the system. Obviously, with any liberalization, if you actually implement it, gold imports will go up. The question is, who was allowed to implement? And there, as I understand it, again, I have to collect this information at a distance, the Department of Trade in the Commerce Ministry has a criterion of who it nominates as star exporters, star trading houses, prime exporters, and that objective criterion was available. And as I understand it, that criterion was then used to say, here are the guys who can import. Now, the whole objective was to bring down the premium that had built up, and which the government has acknowledged in its note, that had built up in the gold trading because of the constraints on supply. So liberalization would have brought down that premium considerably. Of course, the ultimate aim, and why were we able to liberalize? Because we had weathered the first part of the crisis. We had built up reserves somewhat. There's a little more confidence that things were a little better. Now, further, of course, the ultimate aim was this was a constraint on our industry, on an industry which employs a lot of people. So the ultimate aim was to get rid of it completely. The scheme that is under controversy was run during the first few months of the NDA regime, and finally it was done away with in November 2014. Now, I mean, like any constraints that are imposed on a market system, there would have been some people who made money and some people who didn't. The people who didn't make money objected against the people who did make money, but the people who made money were objecting against others. This kind of thing keeps going on. So ultimately, the idea was to bring back free trading. That's what happened, and that's a good thing.
Okay. No, the charge, Dr. Rajan, is that the circular came on May 13th. When a regime change was in the offing, and therefore, in a sense, mala fide in intent.
Well, I don't want to go into that. I understand this is a big issue in Parliament, etc. The point I think it is important to remember is that this is a period of rapid regulatory change as we're dealing with the foreign exchange crisis. There were a number of ad hoc schemes, ad hoc arrangements, and I can see that there could have been some arguments made that this new government is going to take time to understand, maybe we need to bring it in. I don't know what the rationale was behind the government at that time. The point from our perspective as the RBI was to understand whether there was any objective criteria for doing what was being done. The logic being that we had weathered the foreign exchange crisis, that in fact there were constant representations from the gold industry that there was a shortage of gold, and to some extent there was pent-up demand which was potentially creating other problems. So I think that our job was to see, is this done in a reasonable way? I have not been able to go back to the circulars that were issued and the underlying discussions. What happens in these cases is the department takes care of it and talks to the government and issues them. But of course, as governor, I do bear responsibility for any actions of the RBI.
But could you have said no? Or is this entirely a government preserve and RBI is only an implementer?
No, well, let me put it this way. Any policy has ramifications, both positive and negative. The positive ramifications of any liberalization is that you increase the imports of the object that you've stopped in order to facilitate more work in the industry. There was arguments that a lot of workers have been laid off because of a shortage of gold. We need to re-employ them. So you have to look at that positive aspect. Second, we did not want to liberalize fully because we did not want the flood of gold to come in. We had to do it in steps. If you want to do it in steps, obviously you have to pick somebody to import. There's already the public sector which is importing. You're not stopping them from importing. So in a sense, this is a liberalization. You are adding more people. That has to bring down the premium on gold, which was partly the objective. But when you pick them, the question is, what objective criteria do you follow? If there is a definition by the Department of Trade, that was what the government picked and told us this seems reasonable. And, we looked at the definition and that seemed reasonable. I presume that's the process we followed. And we went out and, in consultation with the government, issued the circular. Now, the new government, if it thought this was a issue of importance, could have acted immediately. As I understand, it took some time to see how this process worked, and eventually, when we had more foreign exchange under our belt, we did away with the scheme. So, to some extent, I think procedures were followed, which is what is important in these situations.
Okay. Well, let me come back to the reason why I invited you about reorganizing public sector banks, or reimagining them. Now, would you say ownership is an issue? I mean, in the sense, if the PNB fraud had happened at a private sector bank, would RBI have been easily able to, supersede the bank like it did in Global Trust Bank in 2003? Do you think ownership is what we have to attack, therefore?
No, look, I think a system with public and private banks can work reasonably. The question is, are the incentive structures in the public bank appropriate? And this is something we need to examine very carefully. What happens in these kinds of situations? How much does the management know? What length of tenure does it have? What incentives does it have to find out what's going wrong and put the appropriate systems in place? And what kind of monitoring does the board do? Is the board composed of engaged professionals who understand risk management and who ask the right questions about risk management and procedures? One of the things we did during my time was we got rid of a whole set of box-ticking requirements we had for the public sector boards and asked them to focus on the 5 or 6 big issues that they needed to keep the bank appropriately managed. Now, we also need to ask questions about who appoints these board members and on what basis, and how the board members are compensated. One of my concerns was that we compensate public sector board members at a much lower rate than the private sector can compensate. So even in the market for board members, the public sector is at a disadvantage. Even if you had a perfectly a perfectly good procedure for appointing them. Of course, the Bank Board Bureau was supposed to appoint them, but that never actually happened. So I think we need to look at all this and see if the governance of the banks by the government is being done in an arm's length professional way, as was suggested during the various Gyan Sangam, or in fact we haven't moved away from that still, and more needs to be done. These are important questions to ask.
Well, fair enough. We did have the Bank Board Bureau, but several managing directors were changed without telling them or without telling their own boards. So do you still think that within the current system of overwhelming government domination, we can run these banks better?
No, I think we have to change that system. Under the current system, the boards have no responsibility for appointing the management.
Yes.
If they have no stick over the management, they don't choose the compensation for the management particularly. If they don't have appropriate sticks over management, what control can they have? And if everything comes from orders from the ministry, as opposed to the board determining things, including the appointments of the board, then essentially you've taken off powers from the board, rendered it fairly toothless, and then you expect it to manage the bank in the bank's best interest. I think we need to think very seriously about public sector bank governance reform. One of the experiments that was tried during my time was to try and bring in private sector people at a lateral level. Of course, you want to be careful about doing too much of it. But one of the problems in doing that, of course, is that private sector people shy away from coming into the public sector banking system, except very few who are motivated by patriotic reasons. You can't rely on that to get a large pool of people into the system. So amongst the things we have to examine, the governance of the public sector banks. Are the boards appropriately appointed and appropriately incentivized and appropriately empowered? The management. Does the management have adequate pay, compensation, etc.? But do they have adequate tenures also? And are they appropriately qualified for the job that they have. We're putting people in charge of 5-10 lakh crores at these banks, and we need the best people in the country to do it in a reasonable way. And of course, they have to have the ability to hire good people, to bring good people into their jobs as executive directors, as head of risk management, and so on. The public sector was a great repository of talent. But over the years, because of a variety of issues, including hiring freezes, including constraints on whether they can hire on campuses or not, their ability to recruit talent has been greatly diminished. Now, ultimately, the issue is not of pay. Public sector banks pay much more up to a certain level than private sector banks, typically at lower levels. It's only at the higher levels that they pay less, and that's precisely where you need the best talent.
Absolutely.
So we need to think about public sector pay also, how to rectify it in a way that does more pay for performance, but also gets good people in there.
Okay, well, just one question on this. Montek thought so, and therefore I'm asking you when I interviewed him. Is the answer bringing down government stake below 50% so that, you're free from all these recruitment constraints?
Look, I think that is an experiment we should try with a few public sector banks. But until you get the governance right, you want to make sure that the board, once you bring the stake down below 50%, is able to govern the bank.
Yeah.
Otherwise, if you have a bank which is not governed by anybody, neither the government nor the board, and management has no oversight, you could get fairly bad outcomes.
Okay.
So I would say the first criterion is to strengthen the governance. There is a chicken and egg problem, that it may be hard to strengthen the governance without first distancing the bank from the government. But we need to work on both at the same time.
Okay. Well, actually, we are running out of time, so I want to try and pack in some more questions quickly. The Reserve Bank has issued a circular almost pushing all the bad loans of vintage loans to the NCLT in the next 6 months. It's a fairly strong circular, and also says that banks should, it's almost looking like an AQR2, and it might put 3-4 percentage points more of already stressed loans into NPAs, but it looks like it will be the last sweep. Do you think that is the way to go?
Well, I think it's important that the NCLT shows some proof of the concept. That is, we must bring some of these resolutions to a conclusion. The banks must get their money back so they be able to unwind some of the provisions they've made. I think that is important, that the time frame that has been given should be adhered to as far as possible. And some of these knotty questions that have arisen, who can bid and who can't bid, should be resolved with some clarity. I think if we do that, then there will be a growing consensus that there is this NCLT which works and which is a resolution of last resort. If nothing else works, we can go there. Which then means that all the out-of-court systems of resolution that we have in place will have a much better chance of working, because banks, way before it goes to the NCLT, and the promoter can sit down and say what makes most sense now, so that we don't have to go into a resolution which can be painful for both of us. So I would very much like to see those first few cases that went in resolved, and resolved with some degree of success, in the sense that the firm is put back on track, the bankers get a fair amount of money back, and we move forward.
Okay. Oh, well, let me see if I can still pack a couple of issues that I want to ask you. Are we on the verge of a trade war? Or do you think this one increase in tariffs from President Trump will pass?
Well, I think, as you saw, given the recent news on Tillerson, it's very hard to predict what this administration will do, both for the good and the unpredictable. My worry is that the big issue, which is the trade imbalance with China, hasn't been addressed as yet. And there are measures that are floating through Washington, especially using Section 301 on unfair trade practices, which are still to be seen. and those have to do with intellectual property and so on, issues which are very dear to the Chinese heart. So my worry is that we haven't seen the end of this process yet. In fact, we may be at an early stage, and there is more to come. So I would not hold my breath saying, I would not rest easy saying that we're done. I think there's more to come.
All right. And on another issue on which, your previous predictions made you famous, the the jobs data came in really excellent. Do you think the Fed has to now hasten rate hikes? And as a consequence, are we going to see some asset bubbles burst?
Well, on the first question, the jobs data also said that wage growth was not as strong as previously feared. So it had a good news, bad news effect. Good news, strong labor market growth, the wage growth that some people want to see more of wasn't huge, but it also brought comfort to the Fed that their pace of tightening was reasonable, but at this point not significantly behind the curve. So I think they will continue between 3 and 4 hikes this year, certainly one this month, which they've prepared the markets well for. There's a lot of leverage which has built up post-crisis. So there will be pain points. Leverage requires easy money, requires a lot of liquidity. And when the interest rates go up and liquidity becomes harder to come by, the sort of lessons of leverage come back to hit you. So I think there is an issue there. There will be points. Now it's hard to know where. We will find out as interest rates move up.
Okay, just one more minute to go before the line snaps. So what about that quote attributed to you that you warned Rahul Gandhi and the Prime Minister of Nirav Modi?
Well, they say you leave India, but India never leaves you. I don't know. Social media seems to have a fascination for attributing complete rubbish to me, and this gets its own life. So absolute rubbish.
Okay. Well, I still believe I have 50 seconds, so let me try. Your inflation control.
We could have stopped it.
Okay. Your inflation control has really worked well.
Latha, I wish the RBI.
Yes. Go ahead.
I'm just saying I wish the RBI had known of the scandal when it was happening. If we had, we'd have stopped it. But the truth is, this is something that was off the books, that we, didn't come onto our radar screen because it was completely opaque to us. We need to understand what went on there and how we stop it. And as you just said, the RBI has taken some measures on this regard.
All right. Well, we have to stop there because the line will snap. Thank you very much, Dr. Rajan, for answering a whole range of questions on which a lot of people want to know your side of the story as well. That's Raghuram Rajan, former Governor, Reserve Bank of India, clarifying so many things that all of us wanted to know. Thank you very much for watching this show.